So I just got myself a Steam controller, and I wanted to do a review because I've been tinkering around with it for a couple days now, and I think I know enough about it to do a review. I know a lot of people on YouTube who are doing reviews and unboxing in the same day, and that's not enough time to really familiarize yourself with the device. And for the purposes of this particular review, I wanted to compare and contrast the Steam controller's functionality with the functionality of the gold standard controller for PC gamers, which is the Xbox 360 controller. Now, I realize that this is the rock candy version of the Xbox 360 controller, but it shouldn't matter because all of the input variability and degrees are exactly the same as a standard Xbox 360 controller, so for the purposes of this review, it will make absolutely zero difference. So right off the bat, the first thing that you notice about the Steam controller is that instead of an analog stick and a D-pad, it actually has two trackpads. Now, Valve recognized that the left trackpad is actually going to be used more often than not as a D-pad, so what they did was that they included an indentation on it that actually gives you a tactile indication of where the D-pad is relative to the rest of the trackpad. That way you can still use this as a regular trackpad, but most games are going to be using it as a D-pad, so Valve has offered you a little bit of assistance for using this trackpad as a D-pad by putting an indentation on it, which I think is actually a really clever design feature. On the back of the controller, you'll notice that there are actually two extra grip buttons, and the reason that they're there is on a normal controller, there's actually a lot of wasted potential back here because you have 6 fingers that are essentially doing nothing 100% of the time other than gripping the actual controller. So offering some functionality for your back fingers is actually a really good design feature. Although I'm a little bit disappointed because as long as they're addressing this, why don't they also address the fact that you have 6 fingers that are doing nothing, but there are only 2 extra inputs? They could have very easily put, an extra input down here for your pinky and ring finger, and then had an extra input up here for your middle finger. I don't think that would have been too much of a stretch, but hey, 2 extra inputs is 2 extra inputs. That already makes the back of the Steam controller much more functional than the back of the Xbox 360 controller. So, can't really complain about that. Valve also went ahead and addressed a problem that I didn't even know I was having with the Xbox 360 controller, and that is in regards to the variability of the left and right triggers. With the Xbox controller, the input is variable all the way down until it's bottomed out. The problem with the Xbox 360 controller is that the input actually maxes out well before the trigger's bottomed. So it's very, very difficult to get a lot of variation because it's only about 3/4 of a centimeter of space that you have to deal with. So it's very difficult to get a lot of variation. Say if you're driving a car in a game and you don't want to go full speed, it's extremely difficult. But with the Steam controller, you can actually control the variation a lot easier, but it's not maxed out until there's an audible click. There is aural and tactile feedback for both the left and right trigger that absolutely lets you know that the trigger's bottomed out, and I think that is absolutely genius, and I didn't even realize that was a problem with the Xbox 360 controller until I tried the Steam controller. So the ergonomics of the actual controller itself are generally really good, except for one particular feature. I love the ergonomics of the triggers. I do not like the ergonomics of the bumpers. The bumpers are very square shaped at the top. There is a very noticeable vertice here at the top, and that might be a little bit of an issue for some people. I know me, it gouges me right in the knuckle. With the Xbox 360 controller, it has a very rounded top, so the bumpers fit very comfortably in your hand, and that is a point for the Xbox 360 controller. And for some people, it might not be a point against the Steam controller, but I have very small, stubby hands, so it's a little bit of a detraction from this particular device's functionality for me personally. In terms of connectivity, they actually give you a USB cable that you can use to plug the controller directly into the computer, or you can plug it into the dongle that they give you to connect the Steam controller wirelessly to your computer. It takes up about 8 cubic centimeters of space. It's very non-intrusive. It fits in with my setup really well. I have no complaints about its size, because I know some wireless receivers are rather large, and this one is actually very non-intrusive. I was kind of impressed. So what are my impressions of the Steam controller's trackpads? Because those were the primary selling point for me, because I have an extremely hard time in FPS games in particular aiming with the analog controller. I know there are console gamers who are extremely used to it. They've been doing it for years. They've been doing it since the early 2000s, and they have absolutely got it down. And for somebody who's typically a PC gamer and they're like, oh yeah, I want to recline in my chair, I want to take it easy, I would rather use a controller for some games. They go out and buy themselves an Xbox 360 controller like I did, and then they find themselves saying, what in the living fuck am I supposed to do with this extra analog stick? This is completely useless to me. So the trackpads actually give you a lot of functionality because you can use it to emulate a lot of different input methods. You can actually use it to input, you can use it to emulate roll balls, like those really old mice that have the balls on top, and you spin the ball and the cursor goes across the screen. It actually, you can emulate that with the trackpad, and that's included in the software. You can emulate a analog stick so that you can get a flick style action across the surface of the trackpad. You can emulate just a mouse so that it functions a lot like the trackpad on your laptop. And you just have an incredible amount of customization. However, because it is a flat surface and not an actual analog stick, you will have to get used to the way it feels if you're using it like an analog stick. If you're using like a trackpad on a laptop, I think it's a lot more intuitive for PC gamers to get into using the trackpad as opposed to an analog stick for FPS games. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of Grid Autosport with the Xbox controller just to see how the analog sticks work with the game and how the trigger works with the game. See, I'm already pushing the trigger down about 1/4 of a centimeter, and I'm still getting no input to the game. I'm pushing it down nearly 1/2 a centimeter, and now it's starting to actually move the car. See, there you have about half of the distance does not actually register to the game. Now, I don't know if that is a dead zone problem with the game itself, but it certainly seems to be an issue because you reach max speed well before the actual input is bottomed out. And to me, that is a huge problem. So, okay, another problem that I've had with racing games like this is that it is impossible to oversteer drift the car. You have to use the handbrake, and that is not actually how you drift a car. It is a particular style of drifting. You can use the handbrake to drift a car, but the actual method of drifting that you want to use is severe oversteer and then reducing your gear on the clutch. So you want to over-rev the engine, spin the back tires, and oversteer at the same time, and then your back end will fly out and you'll be able to go across the corner. With a controller, typically the only way to do this is to use the handbrake. So what we're going to do is we're just going, holy crap. So what we're going to do is we're just going to try to oversteer, and it's a little bit too wide. We hit a wall, doesn't really work. Maybe we can try swinging in and then swinging out a little bit, but it's extremely hard to control. So let's try drifting with the handbrake, and you'll see what I mean. It slows you down considerably. Well, that was very, very bad. But you get the idea that when you use the handbrake to turn, I don't even need to be in a corner, use the handbrake to turn, you slow down considerably. And that is actually a little bit of a problem. So let's evaluate the functionality of the Steam controller as it relates to the Xbox 360 controller in this particular scenario. You'll notice in the last test that I was using the right analog stick to shift my gears up and down. It seems intuitive to me to use a stick to stick shift. That seemed intuitive to me. That's the way I set it up in the settings. And that's the way I've been playing for a very long time. But switching to the Steam controller, there is no right analog stick, so how did I get around this? There is actually options in the software that allow you to simulate the motion and response of an analog stick on the trackpad. So you can flick up, flick down, flick up, flick down. So I was able to actually simulate the motion that I was used to on the trackpad, and it was really, really intuitive and really easy to get used to. So I also made another modification using the software, and that is to the analog stick, because like I said, on a normal Xbox 360 controller, you cannot oversteer drift the car. So I wanted to see if I could tweak the software so that I could oversteer using just the analog stick. And what I did was I completely removed the y-axis, so now the only data that's going to the game is 180 degrees on one side and 180 degrees on the other side, and that's it. No superfluous information is going to the game at all. And what I did as well is I reduced the radius on the outer dead zone, which is the maximum point at which maximum output can be achieved, and it's a lot closer to center now. So the actual movement of the analog stick does not need to be as severe in order to achieve maximum turning in the game. And what I also did was that the inner dead zone, the point at which no information is going to the computer at all, is completely removed. So the analog stick is always sending very, very sensitive information to the game. So let's just see if the oversteering works, and let's see if the gear shifting works. So right here, shift down, shift up, 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 down, 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 down. So it seems to work just as well as the Xbox controller, and the motion for my finger is almost identical. So this is my handbrake. I have it set up the same way it's set up in GTA 5. This is my handbrake. It's just comfortable for me. I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to oversteer, and we're going to see how it does. It was okay right there. That seemed reasonable. I didn't really slow down. I mean, I slowed down a little, but you have to downshift to compensate for the extent to which you're going to slow down. Oversteer. Yeah, there we go. So now you'll see that it's actually possible to oversteer drift the car because I've edited the settings on the analog stick to accommodate my driving style. So I thought that was a really, really nice feature. So now we're going to test the Xbox 360's functionality in a third-person shooter. I'm choosing Shadow of Mordor for a couple of reasons. A, there's no difference between a third-person shooter and a first-person shooter if all we're looking for is how well we can look around the environment and how well we can aim a crosshair. If those are the only things we're concerned with, a third-person shooter will be just as good as a test as a first-person shooter. And B, Shadow of Mordor is notoriously bad for having poor aiming and camera functionality on PC. It is heavily optimized for consoles, so I anticipate that the game will work well with an Xbox 360 controller, but not well enough for a PC gamer. So I will be able to utilize full functionality with the controller, however, it'll just piss me off. Alright, so we're in the game right now, we're maxing out the stick on one side, and looking around the environment is painfully slow. You can adjust the sensitivity, but the difference between small increments with a flick style action and the maximum, there's a huge disparity that I don't really like. So let's try aiming and shooting some orcs and see what happens. It looks like there's some over on this side. So I'm aiming, trying to flick, flick, flick. There's one, there's two, there's three. What the hell is that? Got him. I ran out of focus and I still am almost maxed on arrows. Whoops. Shit. I can't really move the cursor as fast as this thing is flying. I screwed up, and it's extremely frustrating. So, to me, the Xbox 360 controller works in most ways in a game like this. Except for the camera and aiming systems, like most shooter games, it doesn't really work for me because it's just not sensitive enough. It doesn't offer the same variability that you get out of a mouse. It doesn't offer the same kind of control that you get out of a mouse. I'm done. So now we're going to test the Steam controller with Shadow of Mordor, and the right trackpad is now configured to emulate a mouse, so it'll function quite similarly to the way a trackpad on a laptop will function. And there's also an added feature that I've enabled in the software called Trackball, and it will actually take the velocity of my movements across the trackpad, and it will continue inputting information even though my thumb is no longer on the trackpad. For example, if I swipe, the camera will continue to rotate for some time, but I can stop it rotating by just putting my thumb back down on the trackpad in the middle of its movement. So swing stop, swing stop, swing stop, swing stop. So it's a very intuitive way of looking around the environment using this style of input. So there's some orcs right there, they're reasonably far away. Didn't take long to get him at all. Can't hit him. There's some bats flying in the air. Hit that one. Hit that one. I'm far further through my arrows and far less through my focus with the Steam controller than I was with the Xbox controller. It seemed much more difficult to aim with the Xbox controller, at least for me. There are some console gamers who are going to be more proficient with this device than I am with this device. I realize that, because I have only been using the Steam controller for 2 days, whereas some console gamers have been using Xbox controllers with analog sticks since the early 2000s. So I realize that I still have a lot of learning to do, but right out of the box, practically right out of the box, it was far superior as a device for aiming and even looking and generally just traversing and exploring the environment. It seems like a much more intuitive tool to use for this particular job. So what do you do if you have a game that does not have Steam controller support? Well, this has been a massive point of contention in the gaming community amongst people. And people on one side will say, well, there's no point in getting a Steam controller because you need a Steam controller profile to play the game. And then the other half will say, like, well, most AAA titles, or all AAA titles, will have a Steam controller profile already built in, so it doesn't really matter. And both sides are kind of right and wrong. This is a major release title. This is Alien Isolation. This game was no slouch when it came out, and it does not have Steam controller support. So what I did was I went into the customization and I basically just assigned the inputs on the controller to my keyboard and mouse. And we'll go into the game and we'll see how well the Steam controller works. Oh, it's like the game was designed to use the Steam controller. So even if you have a game that does not have native or supplied Steam controller support, you can still play with a Steam controller. Now, before we get too heavily into the software side of it, I wanted to talk a little bit about the D-pad, because Valve actually addressed a really significant design oversight with almost every single other controller that's on the market, and they were specifically able to do this because of the trackpad design. Now, the D-pad on a typical controller, especially an Xbox 360 controller, is all one piece. The D-pad is a single assembly with 4 buttons underneath. That means that you can actuate one button and accidentally actuate a button that's immediately adjacent to it. And if you look on the forums for fighter games like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, there are a lot of people who are furious about the functionality of the Xbox 360 controller's D-pad. And there are actually tons of tutorials on YouTube about how to physically take the controller apart and modify the D-pad to lessen the severity of the problem. Now, I might be a little bit of a snobby consumer, but I don't want to buy something that I would have to take apart and then reassemble in a particular way in order to get it to function the way it's intended to function. That's not what I paid for. Now, Valve addressed this issue by making this D-pad one button. There's one button underneath, but there's 4 inputs. And the reason that makes sense is that whether or not your finger is up, down, left, right, it doesn't matter. You're hitting the same button underneath. There's only one button. And the input is determined by your finger's position relative to center. So if you're clicking that single button and your finger is on the trackpad to the right, it's going to register a right. And same with down, left, and up. It's an ingenious design because it makes it absolutely impossible to ghost another input and accidentally actuate a button that you didn't want to press. So that is an incredible design from Valve, and I'm actually really impressed that they had the foresight to think about that and do it that way. So now let's move on to the software side of it. This is the software that comes with Steam Big Picture Mode and is automatically available to you when you register your Steam controller. Now, I know I'm taking a video of my screen instead of just doing screen capture, but fuck it. I'm just going to be verbally communicating to you all of the options that are on the screen anyway, so I didn't want to go through all of the hassle of setting up screen capture. Sorry. So you go to the right trackpad, and go to Style of Input, and here's where all of the options really come from. You have directional pad if you want them both to function like D-pads. I'm not quite sure why you do that, but if you wanted that, you can customize it, you can do that. Button pad, mouse, if you want this to function like a laptop trackpad and have it function like your mouse, you can do that. Mouse joystick, this is a weird option because it kind of makes it function halfway between a mouse and a joystick, and it's really hard for me to put into words exactly how that feels or exactly how it behaves. It's something that you'd have to just try and get used to. Joystick move, so that would be like the joystick for moving your character around or moving your car around. Joystick camera, that's the camera options, and both of these behave in 2 different ways, and you can program exactly how they behave in the controller itself. Scroll wheel, if you're navigating your desktop and you want to actually put the scroll wheel on that side, you can actually do that. The touch menu, and mouse region. Mouse region actually allows you to bind regions of your screen to regions of the trackpad, which is actually a really cool feature. The click is right click. Now, because this is not a D-pad, no matter where I click the button on the trackpad, it will actuate that single right click, and that's the right click of the mouse. The sensitivity for this game, I have it jacked a little bit. Rotation, you can actually set the rotation, and the rotation is where the horizontal midpoint of the trackpad is. So, like me, I actually pay pretty close attention to where the center line is, so mine is pretty centered. I treat it like it's completely vertical and completely centered. But some people have a little bit more of a skewed grip, and they'll use it like it's facing off at an angle, and you can actually set the horizontal line of the trackpad to an angle if you want. Acceleration, mouse acceleration is basically how many pixels per inch the mouse is moving along a curve relative to its actual physical movement across the mouse pad. So if for example, if you move the mouse slowly, the more slowly it'll move on the screen, and the more quickly you move it, the more quickly it'll move across the screen. But it will multiply the value by a certain extent. So if you're moving it slowly, there's a multiplier that it will apply that will move it slower than a 1-to-1 ratio, and then if you're moving it quickly, there's a multiplier that it will apply that will move it quicker than a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's called mouse acceleration. If you're a PC gamer, you know that mouse acceleration is like the bane of your existence, and you usually, when you do a clean install of Windows, you go straight to the mouse options and you deselect enhanced mouse precision, which is the mouse acceleration option. That's the first thing that you do, is you turn that shit off because it's useless when you're using a mouse for PC gaming. However, it is not useless when you're using the trackpad on the Steam controller. It's actually really useful, so I set it to low. The trackball mode, when you flick the trackpad and it continues sending inputs for a period of time, you can actually adjust that time period between low, medium, and high. If you wanted to swing around for a long time, you set it to low. This is the friction amount. So low friction would mean that you flick it and it goes flying for a really long time. So I set it to medium for this particular game, haptics to low. The haptics are the tactile feedback that you get from the controller itself as you're using it. And there are advanced options. Mouse smoothing, edge spin radius. This is actually really important because they know that the trackpad is actually, I mean, it's large, but at the same time, in some games, it can feel really small. You might actually get to the edge before you're rightfully finished moving, and you don't want to flick and have to stop the camera. There are some situations where that's a problem. So what they do is they allow edge speed. So basically, you do a flicking motion, but you stop at the edge, and it will take all of that velocity information, and it will continue the last registered velocity from the center, and as long as you keep your finger at the edge of the trackpad, it will continue moving the camera in that direction. Another thing that you can set up with the controller is the trigger press mouse dampening. Basically what that is that it will change certain sensitivity parameters on the trackpad as long as one of the buttons, and you select which button you want to use, is actuated. So if you are looking around with this trackpad and using it as a camera, it will function one way, and then maybe in the game you're holding down the left trigger in order to aim your gun, and you want the sensitivity to change. You can actually do that by setting the mouse dampening. So I'm not going to go over any of the other variable inputs because they all pretty much function the same, but I will go over one extra input method, and that's called the gyro. So far as I can tell, there is an accelerometer inside the actual Steam controller that will allow you to use the Steam controller to look around the environment, and you can use it like a mouse or like a joystick. So you click on the gyro and style of input. It gives you all of the same inputs to choose from as before, and it gives you an enable button. So if you only want to use the gyro some of the time, say if you're for looking around the environment, if you just want to use one of the trackpads, you can do that. But say when you're aiming, you hold down the left trigger, you can set the left trigger to enable the gyro, and then the gyro will allow you to actually use the controller to aim in the game. And I thought that was a really interesting feature. You set the sensitivity, you can also set the gyro's rotation if you're the type of person that sits like with your controller at an awkward angle. You can actually set the rotation for the gyro as well to compensate. Acceleration. Gyro lean left binding and gyro lean right binding are basically inputs that you can assign to jerking the gyro in a particular direction really quickly. You can have them do certain commands by using the gyro, which is an interesting function. It also has haptics, so it has a tactile feedback. Go to advanced settings. It has sensitivity vertical scale, which is basically how sensitive the vertical axis is, or I guess that's the horizontal axis, is to the vertical axis. So if you set this option really low, the vertical axis reduces in sensitivity, and the horizontal axis increases in sensitivity, and anywhere past 50-50, it's vice versa. So setting it to 50-50 means that they're both at both the X and Y axis are both at the same amount of sensitivity. It also has mouse dampening, and you can actually set whether or not you want it to look left and right using yaw or using roll. You can either roll the controller or you can use yaw, and that's a really useful feature for somebody who doesn't want to crank the controller all the way in one direction. You can just turn it like a steering wheel almost. It has mouth smoothing options, minimum movement threshold options. It's an extremely customizable controller, and I think for PC gamers, it annihilates whatever else is on the market, unless you are a PC gamer who got into using a controller really, really early, or the controller comes naturally to you and you don't really see a problem with using these inputs that can't really be very customized without third-party software that's kind of dodgy. The Steam controller might be for you if you're the type of person who was a PC gamer your entire life, or the controller style inputs and the analog stick inputs don't come naturally to you like me. I'm really bad with them. This controller was incredibly functional. My personal take on it is that this thing fucking blows any other controller away, and it's not a novelty. It is actually a highly functional controller with incredible precision and functionality, and this is pretty much the last controller I'll ever need to buy as far as I'm concerned. Until something superior to this comes down the pike, this is pretty much what you need to buy if you're a PC gamer and you're frustrated with this style input if you're wanting to use a controller.